Hey everyone, this is Blair Erickson with Real Progressives, and today I want to talk about wealth inequality in America and busting the kind of myth of punishing success, while also talking about why it's not necessarily rich people who are the problem, but a certain type of rich people who are the problem in our economy. So we often hear the slogan, "We are the 99%," especially among progressive groups. And the slogan, what this is really talking about is how a majority of Americans, a vast majority of us, are not in that very, very wealthy group, that we do not have that high quality of lifestyle, the super access to resources and capital, and we are seeing these laws passed to benefit these folks, and it does not help and it does not aid most of us. But what we fail to see when we look at it just that way is that there are different types of wealth, and that the people who are in the extremely super wealthy group are different, very different, than the general kind of 1% distinction. So, according to the Institute for Policy Study, the wealthiest 20 people in the entire United States, the wealthiest 20, have more wealth than half of the American population. So, you have a country of almost 320 million people, and 20 people, that's 20 people, have more wealth than half of them. When we talk about what to do about this problem, you'll often hear a reaction from conservative Republicans or neoliberal Democrats that to tax these folks, to tax the rich, is to punish success. And in some ways, what they're saying is that these people earned that money and it's not fair. In the United States, we're very concerned with the concept of fairness, and much of what our political ideologies argue about is what is fair, what is the fair way for us to govern our society and civilization. But if we look at the 1% as a group, what we see is that it is not what we have necessarily in our heads, that they're all rich people are created the same, that they all live this certain type of lifestyle, and that the 99% of us are in the sort of different group. And especially when you talk about the 1%, when you're looking at major metropolitan cities where the expense of living in that city is incredibly high. So we're talking about places like San Francisco, where I live, or New York City. In these places, if you look at the expenses of living, there's a lot of folks in the 1% who actually do not even have that kind of extremely wealthy lifestyle. They actually have to almost worry about the same sort of struggle, household issues that many of us have to deal with every day. They aren't massively growing their wealth. Their wealth is about the same as most people's, where we have sort of a savings and we know how much we have to expend on our quality of life, but the wealth, the resources that they have are not dramatically shooting up. But there's a different group in this 1% that is very, very different, and that is the 0.1%. Now, the 0.1%, it's not a lot of people. It's about 115,000 households total in the United States. But that is the group that we want to look at, because that's the group that's actually very, very, very different. This 0.1%, when you look at how much wealth they have, the 0.1% have as much wealth as the bottom 90% of the United States. So when we look at what they actually control in terms of capital and wealth, they have a vast majority of it. And this wealth is not like the wealth of every wealthy person in America. Their wealth is actually often parked in offshore accounts. And these are tax havens, these are overseas shelters that help them basically take money out of the economy, keep it, and never put it back in any possible way. So let's look at this chart chronicling 100 years of the share of total U.S. wealth from the Washington Center for Equitable Growth. Now, what we see here in this chart is 100 years of wealth history, and we look starting from the beginning, right before the Great Depression. And you can see right before the Great Depression, you have a big sharp rise in that 0.1%. This is the 0.1%'s total share of wealth. And going into the 1920s, you see this rapid ascendance of this 0.1% class, and the bottom 90% of America declining in what they control. So they're slipping, and the 0.1% is rising. And then right about 1929, when we had the big stock market crash, you see the dramatic slide, the fall into this U-shaped curve of that 0.1% share of the wealth. The stock market crashes, they lose their share of the total wealth, regulations are put in place, and we don't see that kind of rapid rise of the 0.1%. The things that change after 1978 is that the wealth concentration among those very wealthy has been rising, and that's fueled in particular by the gains of the 0.1%. The families in that group, the 0.1%, they see their share of the total increase dramatically during this period, and it begins to return back to the 1929 levels prior to the Great Depression. Those are the people you think about when you think about the wealthy. These are the people who have the mega yachts. These are the people who have the personal helicopters. They're living in, this vast luxurious lifestyle. But the lifestyle is less important. What's really important here is that the 0.1% are a wealthy group that tends to store a vast majority of their wealth in offshore accounts. These are tax havens and shelters in islands and Swiss bank accounts, and they are extracting a vast quantity of wealth out of the economy, and it's not going back in any meaningful way. What's very important in this chart is that it has not been since the Great Depression in the United States that the top 0.1% has controlled so much of the lion's share of the wealth in the United States. So how is this group doing it? What makes them different than every other wealthy person? So take a look at this chart here, where we break down in the 1%, we break down the income inequality within the group of the wealthy. And you're going to see that there's the top 0.01% and the top 0.1%, and their behavior on that chart is very different. So this 0.1% and the extremely wealthy, even among that group, you'll notice the ripples in that group do not match the flat lines that we see in the bottom there. So for 90% of the wealthy, their income does not achieve this kind of escape velocity. What they mean is that it's not rapidly reproducing itself, that being wealthy for some is not in itself a source of wealth. And this is where I think a lot of the confusion about wealth in America comes from. There is something different happening among some of the wealthy that is not happening for all the wealthy. And what we're going to do is let's take away the outside the 0.01%, and let's look at what this line at the top here, this chart going back to the 1970s, let's see how this lines up with the S&P 500. So if we look at this chart, and we look especially after the 1979 period, you see a very nice reflection of the stock market. You see that as the stock market grows, so too does their wealth, and as the stock market declines, their wealth declines as well. And when we talk about inequality in America, especially in recent years, what we fail to see often is that what we're talking about is the folks who are riding the stock market and not the people who are the hard workers. So these are the people whose wealth is in itself the source of more wealth. They are not contributing insightful ideas, building companies. They're not working very hard jobs. They're not taking on lots of responsibility. What they're doing is they have a massive amount of capital, and then they're applying that capital to the stock market in a huge percentage, and then they're receiving the rewards of the stock market. So who's in this group, this top 0.1%? Who are these people who have so much of the lion's share of the wealth? Well, who do you have in there is people like Steve Cohen, who's a hedge fund billionaire, and he's done a series of shady business practices. His previous firm, SAC Capital, was shut down by the federal government for insider trading. Owns tons of mansions, has all sorts of ridiculous kind of opulent things like a 14-foot shark and formaldehyde, indoor basketball court, glass enclosed pool, 6,700 square foot ice skating rink with a Zamboni machine. You have banker CEOs like Jamie Dimon, who works for JP Morgan Chase and has paid billions in fines for all sorts of corrupt practices but never gone to prison. And you have people like, remember the presidential candidate Carly Fiorina, who has made millions and millions of dollars while driving Hewlett-Packard into the ground and costing tens of thousands of people their jobs. You also have military contractor CEOs, people like Wes Bush of Northrop Grumman, Robert Stevens of Lockheed Martin, and James McInerney from Boeing. A lot of these folks, what we talk about in this 0.1% group, they don't even ever really put their roots down in any particular city. They just kind of roam around from different addresses and follow the favorability of tax codes. The reason that a lot of this is so important is that by simply dividing into two tribes, the rich versus the poor, we're not even actually being fair to all the rich people, because there are wealthy people who are not living this kind of rentier capitalist lifestyle. They're hard workers. They're people who are like doctors and lawyers who work many long hours and have earned their capital and their wealth through years of hard labor and earning a good salary for doing a very highly skilled profession. This is not what a lot of these folks are doing, though. These folks who are benefiting extraordinarily from just simply being born with wealth or having wealth and then applying that to the stock market are not themselves generating any value for any of us. They're only generating value for themselves. Now, the rise of rentier capitalism is not a new phenomenon. This has been happening for centuries, really. But what is very different in this era is the degree of financial globalization and the sort of lax codes that have allowed for this group to dominate so much of the planet. This is not even just a United States phenomenon. If you look across the world, the wealthiest 62 people, that's less than 100, 62 people in the wealthiest class have as much wealth as half of the entire planet. So you take all the people in the world, half of them have as much as 62 people. What the solution is for this problem is that we must end the era of tax havens, which has allowed all of these people to avoid any kind of social responsibilities and to sort of siphon the money out of the economy. When we think about what the problem is with having all this wealth, it's that for many of these folks, it's simply about achieving this number in their bank account. And it's not any kind of reasonable amount of capital. When you're talking in the billions of dollars, they are never going to be able to spend all this. And many have no intention of spending it. What they have an intention of doing is hoarding it and using it to amass power. So you can go down through the generations and see these wealthy families amass these great fortunes, and their children are still the powerful people today. That is a fundamental problem. If people keep the money flowing through the economy as some of the wealthy class, right? Not the top 0.1%, but the doctors and the lawyers and the hardworking, folks who earned it through skilled labor. Those folks are spending with an equivalence to their lifestyle. So they, make a lot of money, but they buy a lot of services. They, pay for different goods, and they have expenditures that go back into people's pockets and keep the money flowing through the economy. It's the folks who are getting it out of that Wall Street capital gains that are not contributing it back to the economy. They're hoarding it, and as they're hoarding it, it's diminishing everyone else's ability to earn money. So what this means for us, if we're on the left, is that we must distinguish the type of wealth. We must show that we have that understanding, that it's not just all wealthy people. It's those who are earning their wealth while not working. They're not making it through a salary. They're not contributing back through skilled labor. They are simply acquiring more wealth by having wealth. That is the problem in the economy. And if you're on the right and you're worried about the parasites who are taking over the economy by not working and receiving all your hard-earned money, well, that's actually happening through the super rich. The folks who are doing the least amount of work, who are doing, not working 2 jobs at Walmart trying to keep a family afloat, they're born with vast amounts of wealth. And then through stock market manipulation, they're rapidly growing that wealth. That is going to them, not to you, and they didn't work for that. They didn't earn it. They didn't hard work themselves into that great fortune. They got it by having money, and that's it. It's not the sports stars. It's not the doctors. It's not the dentists. It's not the celebrities. Those are not the folks, the people earning it through salaries. Those are not the people who are harming the economy. It is the rentier capitalists who were born with vast amounts of wealth who simply got the wealth by having money. This is the practice we must stop, and we must end the offshore tax havens that allow them to extract money out of the economy and not ever participate or put it back.